I bought the house because I wanted privacy more than anything else. It backed up against a large area of woods that nobody really seemed to use. The fence, parts of it leaned, sections were covered in vines, and every spring the brush along it grew so thick that you could barely see where the property line actually was. I had been putting off clearing it for months because it was a miserable job. The area was full of thorn bushes, fallen branches, and those little saplings that seemed to grow overnight. One day I finally decided I was tired of looking at it. The weather was decent, not too hot yet, and I figured if I spent most of the day working on it, I could get the whole stretch cleaned up. I started around mid-morning. I had a pair of loppers, a rake, gloves, and one of those battery-powered trimmers. It wasn't difficult work, just slow. Every few feet I'd uncover something buried under leaves or vines. Old cans, pieces of broken plastic, rusted wire. I found what looked like part of an old lawn chair that had probably been sitting there for 15 years. The woods behind my property always felt a little strange. Sometimes I'd find things that didn't make sense. A couple months earlier, I'd found a shopping cart nearly half a mile into the trees. I found children's toys scattered around a clearing where there were no houses nearby. There were old trails back there, too. The previous owner had mentioned once that people wandered through the woods. That was what I was thinking about when I came across the bush. It was larger than the others and packed tightly against part of the fence line. I was cutting branches away and I saw something reflecting sunlight underneath it. I thought it was a soda can. When I pulled some branches aside, I realized it wasn't. There were needles, a lot of them, a pile. Some were still capped, some clearly weren't. A few looked old, while others looked relatively recent. There were enough of them that I stopped what I was doing and just stared at them. Someone had dumped medical waste illegally, maybe, and those IDs. There were several plastic cards scattered underneath the bush, driver's licenses, state IDs, at least that's what they appeared to be. Some were covered by dirt and leaves. I remember crouching down but not getting too close. The whole thing felt wrong. I wasn't interested in touching anything. The needles alone were enough to make me back away. I wasn't dealing with it right then. I finished clearing a few more feet of fence line, but honestly, my focus was gone after that. The whole discovery bothered me because it wasn't random trash. It looked hidden. If I hadn't been cutting through the brush, I never would have seen it. I packed up my tools and went back inside. I washed my hands, grabbed something to eat, and sat at the table, trying to decide what to do. I ended up making a few phone calls and leaving it at that. I don't want to get into details regarding that. I reported what I'd found. I couldn't stop thinking about it because it was unusual. The bush was close enough to my house that someone had clearly been on my property at some point. Maybe not recently, but still. By late afternoon, I found myself sitting near the back window overlooking the woods. I had music on, and I was smoking while occasionally looking outside. I wasn't conducting surveillance. I was mostly being nosy. Part of me wondered if somebody would show up looking for whatever had been hidden there. The window gave me a pretty good view of the backyard. Beyond the grass was the fence. Beyond the fence was the wall of trees. I remember switching playlists at one point and opening another drink. The whole thing had almost become boring, but I saw this thing. I thought it was two people walking through the woods. The property line wasn't clearly marked once you got deeper into the trees, and people wandered around back there. But their direction. They weren't moving parallel to the woods. They were walking toward my house. I leaned forward and watched. My assumption was that they were women. From a distance they looked tall and thin with what appeared to be long hair. They got closer. The problem was that the closer they got, the harder they became to identify. Even now I struggle to explain what I mean by that. When someone approaches you from a distance, details become clearer. You start distinguishing clothing, facial features, body language. You can tell roughly how old they are. You can tell whether they're male or female most of the time. The opposite seemed to be happening. I could see movement. I could see shape. But details weren't appearing. If anything, they seemed absent. At one point, I remember standing up from the chair because my eyes felt like they weren't focusing correctly. I thought the window screen was creating some kind of visual effect. I slid the window open. The view became clearer. The figures didn't. The two shapes kept moving toward the backyard at a slow pace. They must be wearing unusual clothing, something that obscured their appearance. But if they were wearing dark clothing, I still should have been able to distinguish faces. But this felt like I was looking at people-shaped silhouettes that happened to be standing. I've tried explaining it before, and it always sounds weird. I was confused. I spent few minutes trying to figure out what I was seeing. The figures crossed between two trees and entered a more open area behind my fence. I remember squinting. I remember rubbing my eyes. When I looked again, they were still there, still approaching, and I still couldn't identify a single detail about them. The closer they got, the more wrong the entire thing felt. Their movement didn't seem human. It's difficult to describe. Imagine watching someone walk from far away while missing tiny pieces of motion. Like your brain expects to see natural body movement, but something isn't lining up correctly. That was the sensation I had. I couldn't point to exactly what was bothering me. I just knew something about the way they moved made me increasingly uncomfortable. I stepped away from the window and walked into the kitchen, grabbed another cig, came back and looked outside again. They were closer, a lot closer. I felt genuine fear. The fear came from the fact that I still couldn't answer the simplest question imaginable. Who were they? By that distance, I should have known. I should have been able to see faces. It felt like my brain kept reaching for details that simply weren't there. I moved closer to the glass. I was trying to focus on individual features and getting nowhere. My eyes would settle on where a face should be, and it was like there was nothing there to lock onto. I was staring at the two figures and trying to decide whether I should go outside and ask what they wanted or lock the door and ignore them. Neither option felt right because I still couldn't figure out what I was looking at. People had wandered through the woods before, but nobody had ever walked directly onto my property. Once they came through the fence, they were suddenly much closer than they had been a few seconds earlier. My heart starting to race because I realized that at that distance, I should absolutely have been able to identify them. Even now, I can picture the scene. The grass, the fence, the position of the trees behind them. What I can't picture are faces. There aren't any in the memory. The figures continued toward the house at the exact same pace they had been moving the entire time. Neither appeared to react to anything around them. I found myself backing away from the window. Part of me was trying to explain it. No clothing could explain why I couldn't identify hands. No clothing could explain why I couldn't tell where their legs actually were. The figures looked roughly human-shaped, but the details seemed missing. The best comparison I can think of is when someone is standing behind heavily frosted glass. You know there's a person there. You can see movement, you can estimate height and build, but details vanish. But here, there was no glass between us, just open air. I remember one of them appearing slightly taller than the other. That's about the only thing I'm confident about. Both continued moving toward the back of my house. I still couldn't see a face. I was just overwhelmed by the feeling that something was deeply wrong. The fear hit me, and it surprised me. The figures were still approaching. I yelled. I snapped completely out of whatever stunned state I'd been in. I turned around, grabbed my keys, and headed for the front door. Got outside, got into my truck, started it. I looked toward the backyard through the mirrors, but couldn't see anything from that angle. A few minutes later, I was on the road heading toward my parents' place. I arrived at my parents' house acting like a lunatic. I scared them. I tried explaining everything and quickly realized how insane it sounded. I kept hearing myself describe two figures in my backyard and thinking it sounded like I was having some kind of breakdown. My mom asked if someone had threatened me. I stayed there that night. Every time I considered going back to the house alone, I felt sick to my stomach. My father drove over there with me during daylight. Nothing had been damaged. Nothing had been stolen. I walked around trying to make sense of it. There was nothing unusual about the glass. Nothing unusual about the angle. I spent a lot of time thinking about the woods behind that house. There had always been odd little things, enough to create an uneasy feeling, noises at night, evidence that people had been back there even though nobody ever seemed to admit using those trails. As strange as the needles were, I think they were unrelated. They were concerning for obvious reasons, but they felt like something explainable. People hide things, people dump things, people do stupid things. The figures felt completely separate from that. The only connection was timing. If I hadn't found the needles, I wouldn't have spent hours sitting at that window watching the woods. I would have finished my yard work and gone about my day. I would have missed whatever happened. The discovery under the bush kept me in that chair long enough to see those figures approach the house. Had I gone inside and turned on a movie or taken a nap or run errands, I never would have known they were there. After a while, I stopped sleeping well whenever I stayed at the house. Friends told me I was letting my imagination get the better of me. I don't know. Every time I pictured those two figures approaching across the yard, I felt the same fear all over again, because they didn't look like anything. Eventually, I made the decision to move. There were practical reasons too, but that experience was definitely part of it. Convincing my parents that I was serious wasn't difficult, because they'd seen how badly the whole thing affected me. I wasn't acting like someone telling a spooky story. I genuinely wanted out of that house. The property was sold, and I moved away. I've never gone back. I've never had another experience remotely like it. I've seen plenty of strange things in my life that eventually had reasonable explanations. This one never did. Those figures walked from the woods all the way to my yard. With every step, they got closer. And somehow, the closer they got, the less human they seemed. I found the needles that day, and those bothered me for a while. Finding hidden needles and IDs in the woods behind your house is unsettling enough on its own. But years later, I barely think about that discovery anymore. Because whatever those two figures were, whether they were actual people, some bizarre visual misunderstanding, or something I still can't explain, the fear I felt when they crossed onto my property was real. A local company had hired me for a project that was going to keep me in the area for a few months, and instead of renting an apartment, I figured I might as well stay in the old family house. My grandparents had originally started building it decades earlier, and different relatives had added to it over the years. It was a good house. It just happened to be in a place where you could go a long time without seeing another person. The driveway was only for that house. It wasn't a shared access road, and there wasn't anything beyond the property except woods and a few overgrown clearings. I would leave in the morning, work all day, come back, make dinner, and spend my evenings unpacking things that had been sitting in storage rooms for years. There were old family photographs, boxes of tools, furniture nobody wanted to throw away, and shelves full of random household items. My boyfriend planned on moving in with me once he wrapped up a few things where he was living, so I kept telling myself the place would feel less empty once there were two people there. One evening, I was in the living room. Around 11, I saw headlights moving through the front windows. I assumed somebody had pulled into the driveway by mistake. The lights traveled slowly up the driveway. They reflected off the walls inside the house. I figured someone was about to knock on the door and ask for directions, but the lights continued farther up the driveway, then disappeared. A few seconds later, I saw them moving away. The vehicle was already heading back down the driveway toward the road. I couldn't tell what kind of car it was. I mostly saw the lights through the trees. Within another few seconds, it was gone. It was odd. There was no reason for anyone to drive all the way up there accidentally. The driveway entrance was clearly marked, and it wasn't close to any other properties. That same night, I got up to wash dishes before bed. The kitchen had a window above the sink that looked out toward the side yard. I heard footsteps somewhere. It seemed like someone was walking near the house. I turned off the water. I was already imagining things. Rural areas are noisy in their own way. I walked to the window and looked. I checked another window in the dining room and then looked through the front windows. I didn't see a person, a vehicle, or anything else that explained what I'd heard. Deer passed through the property fairly often, so I went to bed and forgot about it. Over the next week, I mentioned both things to my boyfriend during a phone call. He was supposed to move in about a week later anyway, so neither of us treated it as a serious issue. A few days after that, I had a day off and decided to clean up part of the front yard. Small trees and brush had started growing around one side of the property. I spent the afternoon outside with pruning tools, dragging branches into piles and trying to make the place look less neglected. I had the windows open in the house. I was outside and heard a very distinct sound from inside. Sounded exactly like a window being shut. I stopped working, dropped what I was carrying and walked inside to check. The windows I had opened were still open. I walked through every room because the sound had been so clear that I was convinced I would find an explanation. I found nothing. The house was empty. I went back outside, feeling mildly annoyed. When you're alone, every sound seems more important than it really is. The rest of the day was good, but that night, everything changed. I had some work to finish for a friend who ran a small online business. I just needed to help organize some information and send a few files. Around midnight, I finished what I was doing and started getting ready for bed. I checked the doors the way I always did, and turned off lights and headed toward the bedroom. I heard a noise somewhere else in the house. The sound seemed to move. The house wasn't especially large, and when you spent enough time there, you learned what normal noises sounded like. This didn't sound like a house settling. It sounded like someone. My bedroom door was open, so I could see the hallway. I listened. There it was again. The closest comparison I can make is someone walking carefully. Someone, or something that sounded very much like someone, was moving through the house. I got out of bed and quietly shut the bedroom door. I locked it. The lock wasn't strong. I got my phone and stood there listening. Whoever was moving around wasn't wearing heavy boots. It sounded more like rubber-soled shoes. The movement was muted in a way that suggested someone was actively trying to stay quiet. An animal wouldn't move like that. Wouldn't be walking room to room. Somebody had gotten inside earlier while I was outside working. There was a window on the side of my bedroom facing part of the yard. While I stood there holding my phone, I saw someone outside. Someone ran past the window. A person-sized shape moved across the glass so quickly that I only saw it for a second, but it was enough. I had been hearing movement inside the house at the same time. For the first time, I didn't know whether there was one person on the property or more than one. My boyfriend was working a late shift. Calling him was an option, but he was too far away to help immediately. Calling the police crossed my mind, but I was still stuck in that weird mental state. I heard footsteps approach the bedroom door from inside the house, and I stopped doubting what I was hearing. They stopped right outside the bedroom. I knew the layout well enough to picture where somebody would be standing if they were actually outside that door, and that image kept running through my head while I tried to decide whether to call 911 immediately or call my boyfriend first. The doorknob turned. Not the way someone would if they were trying to break in. The bedroom door was old. Whoever was on the other side could tell it was locked immediately. The handle stopped moving and something hit the door. It wasn't a full-force kick, somebody testing it. The frame rattled. More hits came a second later. I yelled that I had a gun. I didn't own a gun. There wasn't one anywhere in the house. But every story I'd ever heard about home invasions made me think that sounding dangerous was better than sounding scared. I yelled, "I have a gun. Get out of my house." I listened for another attack on the door, or for somebody speaking. Nothing. The house became silent. I called my boyfriend. I told him somebody was in the house. He said he was leaving work and heading over. After hanging up, I made the decision to stay exactly where I was. I sat on the floor. Nothing else happened. Later, my boyfriend called and said he was pulling into the driveway. I waited until I heard his truck before unlocking the door. I was nervous walking into the hallway. He checked every room while I followed him around. Whoever had been there was gone. At least that's the conclusion we came to. There was no sign of forced entry, no damaged doors, nothing stolen. The only thing we knew for certain was that I had heard someone moving through the house, and someone had kicked the bedroom door. Everything else was unanswered questions. I spoke with law enforcement, but there wasn't much for me to know. I explained what happened. Here is the thing. It was the behavior. If somebody intended to rob the place, there were easier opportunities. I was gone during the day. The house sat alone. Nobody nearby would have noticed. If somebody wanted to hurt me, there were opportunities for that too. That sounds awful to say, but it's true. The person had apparently been around the property multiple times. The sound inside the house while I was working in the yard, the movement in the house that night, the person running past the window. All of those things seemed connected when I looked back on them. What I couldn't understand was why. Whoever it was seemed patient. They didn't force a confrontation when I was walking around outside by myself. They didn't rush me when I was moving between rooms. Instead, the only direct aggression happened after I locked myself in the bedroom. I've gone over that hundreds of times. If somebody was watching the house, they would have known the bedroom had a lock because it was visible from the hallway. They would have known I was effectively trapping myself inside. So why wait until then? Why kick the door? The whole thing felt less like somebody trying to achieve a goal and more like somebody trying to create fear. That's exactly why I still think about it. A lot of scary situations make sense once enough time passes. You eventually identify a motive or you learn something you didn't know at the time. This never became one of those situations. My boyfriend moved in sooner than originally planned. Neither of us was comfortable leaving me there alone after that. All those things happened within a relatively short period of time and seemed to escalate until that night in the bedroom. I've had people say it was a squatter, somebody using the property without my knowledge, a trespasser who became aware the house was occupied, or someone who had been watching the place because they assumed nobody lived there anymore. The person running outside while I was hearing movement inside the house is what keeps pulling me back. It felt like there were two different people, one inside, one outside. I can't prove that. I can't even say it with certainty. It's just how it felt. The family still owns the house. Most people who see it wouldn't think twice about spending a night there. Whoever it was had multiple chances to do something far worse than they did, and for some reason, they chose not to. The cabin had been in my family for a long time, long before I was born. Sat near a stretch of forest that had a reputation for strange stories attached to it. I wasn't there looking for anything unusual. The whole reason for the trip was actually the opposite. I wanted a few quiet days away from my phone and away from people. The cabin wasn't luxurious by any means, but it had electricity, running water when everything was working properly, and enough space to be comfortable for a long weekend. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by trees on nearly every side. You couldn't see another building from the property. Normally I liked that. The front door, it was just unlocked. The handle turned. I was confused because I knew I hadn't left it that way the last time I visited. I pushed the door open and looked inside. Nothing seemed wrong. Nothing appeared stolen. I checked the bedrooms and bathroom and found the same thing. Maybe I'd forgotten to lock it during my previous trip months earlier. After that, I considered that one of my relatives might have stopped by. A couple of family members still had keys. I sent a few texts asking if anybody had been there recently, then put my phone back in my pocket and started unloading supplies from the car. A little later, I got replies. Nobody had been there. That bothered me slightly, but not enough to make me leave. Old locks can be unreliable. Maybe somebody had checked on the place and forgotten to mention it. Around dark, I went inside, locked the door, and started watching downloaded videos on my laptop. Cell service out there was terrible. Sometimes messages would arrive hours late. After 10, I heard a knock. Whoever was doing it wasn't pounding on the door. I checked the time on my phone and thought how strange it would be for somebody to visit that late. The nearest house wasn't close. Nobody should have been casually walking around out there after dark. I got up and looked through a side window near the front entrance. The porch light was on, but the angle wasn't great. I couldn't see anyone. I waited a minute. Nothing happened. It could have been an animal somehow making the sound. Less than 5 minutes later, I heard knocking again. This time it came from the back door. The cabin had 2 entrances. The front porch faced the clearing, while the rear door opened toward the tree line. Hearing the sound move from one side of the building to the other completely changed how I felt about the situation. There was no reasonable way for an animal to create that pattern. Someone was outside. I checked the front door again, just to make sure, and I heard footsteps. Whoever it was seemed perfectly comfortable walking around the cabin. The sound moved slowly across the porch. Boards creaked under weight. Then the footsteps continued along the side wall. I turned off most of the lights inside because I became aware that anyone outside could probably see me clearly through the windows. I remember feeling mad at myself for not bringing the firearm I normally kept locked at home. I wasn't someone who carried one everywhere, but that night was probably the first time I wished I had. The footsteps went on. I heard something brush lightly against the exterior wall. It sounded like fabric or a hand sliding across wood. Getting to that location required driving several miles down roads that most people didn't even know existed. After about 20 minutes, I worked up the courage to peek through another window. I immediately stepped back. I hadn't seen a face. What bothered me was that I couldn't see anyone. The footsteps had sounded close enough that I expected somebody to be standing nearby, but the clearing appeared empty. The porch was empty, and the area near the car was empty. The tree line beyond the cabin looked dark and still. Then I heard a slow creak above me from the front porch, like someone shifting their weight on one of the boards. I knew the person had to be only a few feet from the front door. No more knocking. I couldn't tell whether the person was gone or standing there waiting. A couple of times I considered calling somebody anyway, just to stay on the line with another person, but the signal indicator kept bouncing between one bar and nothing. The thing that really got to me wasn't that somebody had knocked on the doors. It was how patient they seemed to be. Whoever was outside wasn't doing anything. They had knocked, walked around the cabin, and then seemingly settled into simply being nearby. I heard another sound from outside that I still remember. It sounded like someone clearing their throat. The sound instantly confirmed what I already suspected. There was a person out there. I remained inside another 10 or 15 minutes before finally deciding I wasn't staying the night. When you're actually in that situation, you spend a lot of time trying to convince yourself things aren't as bad as they seem. I kept thinking the person would leave. I started gathering my things as quietly as possible. My keys were on the kitchen counter. I packed my laptop, charger, wallet, and a few other essentials. Most of the food and supplies stayed behind because I was focused on leaving quickly. My car was parked only about 40 feet from the front porch, but those 40 feet felt much farther. I came up with a simple plan. Open the front door, run straight to the car, get inside, lock the doors, and leave. The idea sounded easy enough. Actually doing it was another matter. I was standing near the front entrance with my keys already in my hand. My heart was pounding. I was listening for sounds outside. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. The clearing was empty. I looked toward the tree line. The trees were dense around most of the clearing, but there were gaps where moonlight filtered through. My eyes just naturally moved across the woods. Someone was standing partially behind a tree roughly 30 yards away. The reason I know they were standing there wasn't because I saw a face. I didn't. The person was mostly hidden. What I saw was the outline of a shoulder and part of a torso sticking out from one side of the tree. He was watching the cabin. I ran. I don't remember reaching the car. As soon as the engine started, I locked the doors. I immediately threw the car into reverse and backed out fast. Once I got pointed toward the access road, I drove away without looking back. I called a family member first because I wanted to tell somebody what had happened while everything was still fresh in my mind. After that, I made a few other calls. Eventually, I ended up speaking with authorities. A few days later, after I'd talked myself into believing the entire thing was just some trespasser, I returned to the cabin with 2 relatives. I wasn't interested in spending the night. I mostly wanted to collect the things I'd left behind. Nothing had been stolen. Nothing had been vandalized. Nothing appeared damaged. While checking around outside, one of my relatives saw something near the back of the cabin. There was an old wooden chair that normally sat on the porch. Somehow it had been moved around to the rear side of the building facing the woods. I don't know if that sounds significant. The reason it bothered me was because I knew I hadn't moved it. None of us had. My relatives suggested weather might have blown it over and somebody had picked it up at some point. I remember looking at that chair and feeling uneasy because it seemed positioned almost deliberately, like someone had wanted to sit there facing the trees. Months later, I was talking to an older man from the area. He'd lived there most of his life and knew the woods well. According to him, people used portions of those woods to stay hidden from other people. He said locals occasionally discovered makeshift camps deep in areas most visitors never explored. He said that if somebody had been living out there for a long time, they knew the woods far better than I ever would. They'd know every trail, every shortcut, every place a person could hide without being seen, and they would have noticed me arriving long before I noticed them. Somebody had entered the cabin before I arrived and left when they heard my vehicle. The knocks came from both doors. I heard someone walking around the cabin. I saw a person standing behind a tree watching me. I've replayed that night countless times over the years. If it was a prank, it was an incredibly strange place to pull one. Let's say, trespasser, they showed an unusual amount of patience. I've never spent another night there by myself. Whoever that person was had been standing there quietly, partially hidden behind the trunk, watching the cabin in complete silence. And the fact that they disappeared the second I got into my car has never sat right with me. I have no idea who was out there.